I didn't believe in anything like this before it happened. I wasn't superstitious, and I didn't believe in ghosts or unexplained signals or anything like that. I worked in IT support for a logistics company, and my job was to fix problems that had clear causes. Something broke, you found out why, and you fixed it. That way of thinking is probably why it took me so long to accept that something was wrong. It started with a sound. I live alone in a small flat on the edge of town, in an older building that makes the usual noises you expect. Pipes knock sometimes, neighbors move around, and traffic can be heard faintly at night. I had lived there for 3 years and knew which sounds were normal. This one wasn't. It was a faint clicking noise that repeated every few seconds. At first, I thought it was coming from my laptop because I was working late at the kitchen table. When I closed the laptop, the sound continued. I checked my phone, but it was silent. When I stood up, the sound seemed to be coming from the hallway near the front door. I opened the door and looked into the building corridor. The lights were on, and the hallway was empty and quiet. There was no clicking sound out there. As soon as I closed the door and stepped back inside, the clicking started again. When I pressed my ear against the door, I heard nothing, but when I stepped away, the sound continued as if it was inside the flat with me. The next day, I didn't think much about it. I assumed there was a simple explanation, like an electrical issue or something in the building. Older places often make strange noises, and I had no reason to panic. That night, though, the sound came back at around midnight, exactly the same as before. This time, I decided to track it down. I went through the flat, turning things off one by one. I unplugged the fridge, switched off the boiler, and disconnected power strips. The clicking didn't change. When I stood still in the hallway, the sound seemed closer, not louder, just nearer. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, and after a few minutes, the sound stopped on its own. A few nights later, something new happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to my phone screen lighting up. There was no sound, just the glow from the screen. The time was 2:17 a.m., and there was no notification, no missed call, and no message. I turned the phone off and placed it face down, but moments later, the clicking sound returned. This time, the sound was coming from the bedroom. I stayed still for a moment, listening, and then got out of bed and walked toward the wardrobe. The door was slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. When I pulled it fully open, everything inside was in place, and the clicking stopped immediately. That was when my phone started vibrating with an incoming call. There was no number displayed, just a blank space where the caller ID should have been. I didn't answer it, and after several seconds, the call stopped on its own. The clicking didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep properly after that. From then on, I started paying closer attention to everything that happened. The clicking only happened late at night, usually after midnight. It never happened when I had music playing or when someone else was around. It only occurred when the flat was quiet. One night, when the clicking started, I spoke out loud and said hello. The sound stopped immediately, and when I went back to bed, it started again as soon as I lay down. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown sender. It said, "I know." Before I could reply, another message appeared saying, "You hear it too?" I didn't respond, and after that, the phone locked itself and the clicking stopped. The next day, I checked my phone thoroughly. There was no record of the messages or any incoming calls. There was nothing in backups or logs, and no unusual network activity. I told myself it must have been a glitch, but that explanation didn't hold up the next night when the clicking started earlier than usual while I was watching television. When I muted the TV, I noticed that the clicking seemed to follow my breathing. When I inhaled, the pause between clicks became longer, and when I exhaled, the clicks came faster. I stepped back and said stop out loud, and the clicking immediately stopped. Moments later, I received another message telling me to listen and not drown the sound out. Over the next week, the sound appeared in different parts of the flat. It came from behind walls, under the floor, and inside cupboards, always adjusting to where I was standing. Friends who visited never heard it, and I stopped inviting people over because I didn't want to explain why I kept asking them if they could hear something. The messages continued, short and direct, telling me that silence helped and that I was getting better. Eventually, I recorded the clicking and analyzed the timing. The pattern wasn't random. It matched Morse code closely enough to recognize it. When I translated it, it didn't spell words but pointed to coordinates that matched the location of my building. The next message arrived at 2:17 a.m. and said I was close. When I asked what I was close to, the reply said I was close to hearing it without help. That night, the clicking didn't stop at all. It followed me wherever I went, quiet but constant, until morning. I left the flat and stayed with my sister for a few nights, and everything stopped. No clicking and no messages. On the third night, though, my phone vibrated with a message saying I couldn't leave the signal behind. At 2:17 a.m., my sister's smoke alarm made a single chirping sound. I went back to the flat the next day. That night, I sat in complete silence, and the clicking started almost immediately. This time, I didn't react. I listened carefully and noticed something underneath the clicking. There was another sound, very faint, like breathing that wasn't mine. A message appeared on my phone without any vibration, telling me I could hear it now. When I asked what it was, the reply said it wasn't a what. The clicking stopped, but the breathing didn't, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls but from the space behind them. The final message arrived at 2:17 a.m. and said it was done. Everything stopped after that, and the flat went completely silent. It has been 6 months since then, and the clicking never returned, but silence doesn't feel the same anymore. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, it feels like the silence is listening. I don't think I was the only one who heard it. I think I was just the one who answered. I live in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where people wave at each other without thinking about it. It's quiet, predictable, and not the sort of place where you expect anything serious to happen. That's one of the reasons it took me so long to realize I was being followed. Nothing about it felt dramatic at first, just slightly off in ways that were easy to ignore. I work evenings at a distribution warehouse just outside town, and my shift ends at midnight. I usually get home around 12:30 a.m., and the drive is short with almost no traffic. I'd been on that schedule for years, so I didn't think much of it when I noticed the same car behind me a few nights in a row. There aren't many routes out of the industrial area, so I assumed it was coincidence. After about a week, I stopped noticing the car entirely, which was probably my first mistake. A few nights later, I came home and found my front porch light turned on. I always turn it off before work because it attracts bugs, and I clearly remembered switching it off that evening. I told myself I must have forgotten. The next night, the porch light was on again when I got home. The door was still locked, and nothing else looked disturbed. I went inside, locked up, and went to bed without hearing anything unusual. The following morning, my neighbor asked if I had company over late. When I told her no, she said she thought she saw someone standing on my porch around 1 in the morning. She didn't see them leave and assumed they had gone inside. I laughed it off and said she must have seen me getting home, but she looked confused. That was the first time I felt uneasy. Over the next few days, small things around the house were different. The trash bin was closer to the house than I remembered leaving it. The gate in the backyard was unlatched once, even though I never use it. After it rained, muddy footprints appeared near the side of the house, but they didn't lead away in either direction. I installed a cheap motion light near the porch and another one in the backyard. I didn't want to overreact, and I still wasn't convinced anything serious was happening. A few days later, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper after work. It wasn't in an envelope and didn't have a name on it. The note said, "You got home late tonight." That was all. No threat, no explanation, just a statement. I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside, checking the street and nearby houses for movement, but everything looked normal. The next night, the porch light was off when I got home. The note was taped to my front door instead. This one said, "You forgot it again." I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what it meant, because I hadn't forgotten anything that I was aware of. I tore the note down and checked the small cameras I had installed after finding the first one. They were basic models that only recorded when motion was detected. There were no recordings and no alerts. According to the cameras, no one had been there. About 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night to footsteps outside my bedroom window. They were slow and deliberate, and they stopped directly beneath the window. I lay still and listened, hearing steady breathing from just outside the glass. When I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the window, I only saw my own reflection. The breathing stopped immediately. When I looked again, there was no one there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt beneath the window, but they didn't look like shoe prints. There was no tread pattern, just shallow impressions that pointed toward the house and didn't point away. That was when I called the police. An officer came by, took a report, and walked around the property with me. He said there wasn't much they could do without clearer evidence or a suspect and suggested better cameras. I stayed awake all night after that, but nothing happened. The following week was quiet, and I started to believe the police visit had scared whoever it was away. Then a coworker asked me why I had been sitting in my car in the parking lot after work. I told him I hadn't, but he insisted he'd seen me several nights in a row, sitting with the engine off and watching the building. I laughed it off and said he must have mistaken someone else for me. That night, I stayed behind at work and parked across the lot, turning off my engine. 10 minutes later, a car pulled into my usual spot and parked. The driver didn't get out. From where I sat, the person inside didn't move naturally. Their head stayed too still, and their shoulders were raised in an awkward way. After several minutes, they turned and looked directly at me. Even from a distance, I could tell their face didn't react normally. They got out of the car slowly and walked toward the building with stiff movements, like they were copying something they'd seen before rather than doing it naturally. I drove away before they could turn around. When I got home, my front door was unlocked, and every light in the house was on. There was a note on the kitchen table that said, "You're early." I moved out the next day and stayed with my brother in another state. For 2 weeks, nothing happened, and I started to feel normal again. I thought it was finally over. On the drive back to pack my belongings, I stopped at a gas station about an hour from my house. As I walked back to my car, I noticed someone standing across the lot watching me. They were dressed wrong for the weather and didn't move at all. When I looked directly at them, they didn't look away. They smiled, but the smile came late, like they remembered to do it after the fact. I locked myself in my car, and when I looked again, they were gone. I sold the house within a month and moved again shortly after. I changed jobs and stopped working nights. I stopped following routines and avoided patterns. Still, sometimes I find lights turned on that I don't remember switching on. A few days ago, I found another note under my windshield wiper. It said, "You're getting better at hiding." I don't think it's trying to hurt me. I think it's trying to learn how to be me, and I don't think it ever leaves. I worked the night shift at a small roadside motel just off a state highway in the Midwest. It's the kind of place that mostly serves truck drivers, people passing through town, or locals who need a room for the night because something at home went wrong. The building is older, but it's clean and well maintained, and the work is quiet enough that most nights feel the same. I've worked there long enough to know what's normal and what isn't, which is why the night he checked in stayed with me. Nothing about it was dramatic at first, but it felt different in a way I couldn't explain. It was just after 11:30 p.m. when the bell at the front desk rang. I looked up and saw a man standing in the doorway under the flickering parking lot light. He was average height, slim, and dressed plainly, wearing a jacket that didn't look warm enough for the weather. He wasn't rushing, and he wasn't hesitant either, just standing there calmly as if he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Something about the way he held himself made me pay closer attention than usual. He walked up to the desk and asked for a room for the night in a flat, even tone. I asked for ID, and he handed over a driver's license immediately without fumbling or hesitation. The name matched the face, the photo looked current, and when I scanned it into the system, everything checked out. There were no alerts, no expired information, and no issues with the ID at all. At that point, there was no reason to question anything. He paid in cash and then asked for a specific room number. He didn't ask what rooms were available or what the price was, just named the room directly. That caught my attention because guests almost never know room numbers unless they've stayed before. When I told him the room was available, he nodded slightly, like he had expected that answer. I gave him the key and watched him walk back out toward the parking lot without saying anything else. He didn't have any luggage with him, which isn't unusual for late-night stays. He also didn't ask about checkout time, breakfast, or Wi-Fi, which most guests do. I logged him into the system, marked the room as occupied, and went back to my routine for the rest of the shift. The night passed quietly, with no calls or complaints from his room. When my shift ended around 6 a.m., I left without thinking much about it. I came back the following evening for my next shift, and the day clerk told me housekeeping had been confused that morning. The room was still listed as occupied, but no one had officially checked out. When housekeeping entered, they found the room completely empty. The bed hadn't been used, the towels were untouched, and the bathroom looked unused. There were no personal items, no trash, and no signs anyone had stayed there. Housekeeping assumed the system hadn't updated properly and marked the room vacant. When I checked the system myself, the guest was still listed as checked in and had automatically extended into a second night. I assumed it was a clerical error and corrected the record. The next morning, the same thing happened again. The room was listed as occupied overnight, but housekeeping found it empty once more. This time, the day clerk didn't change anything and left it for me. When I came in that evening, the system showed the guest had stayed for 3 consecutive nights. The payment history showed extensions that shouldn't have been possible without staff approval. When I tried to check the guest out manually, the system froze and refreshed with the stay still active. I called the manager, who said it sounded like a software issue and told me to leave it alone for the night. Even then, it didn't feel like a normal system error. That night, around 1 a.m., the front desk phone rang. It was housekeeping, and the woman sounded uneasy as she asked if the room was supposed to be occupied. She said she could hear movement inside, like slow footsteps crossing the floor. She had knocked and announced herself but didn't get a response and didn't want to enter alone. I told her I'd check it out and walked down the corridor. As I got closer to the room, I could hear something faint inside, like a soft shift in weight. I knocked, announced myself, and waited, but there was no answer. When I opened the door with the master key, the room was empty and spotless, and the sound stopped immediately. I checked the bathroom and closet, found nothing, and locked the door again. When I returned to the desk, the system still showed the room as occupied. Over the next few days, the same pattern continued, with the guests never appearing but the stay extending each night. Housekeeping reported hearing movement again, always stopping when someone approached the door. Our manager contacted IT, who accessed the system remotely and reviewed the logs. According to them, there was no malfunction or corrupted data. The guest was still actively checked in, and the system showed valid activity tied to the room. When my manager asked how that was possible without staff input, IT couldn't give a clear explanation. They advised us to keep monitoring the situation. Out of curiosity, I looked up the name from the ID using public records. The name existed, but there was no recent information tied to it. There were no address updates, no employment records, and no activity for several years. It was as if the person had quietly dropped out of official systems altogether. That didn't prove anything, but it made me uneasy. One night about a week after the initial check-in, I noticed the room's light was on. I was sure housekeeping had turned it off earlier that evening. A few minutes later, I watched from the desk as the light turned off again. No one walked through the hallway, and the door never opened. Housekeeping started refusing to go near the room. One of them said it felt like someone was watching her when she walked past. Another mentioned hearing a chair scrape across the floor late at night. I told the manager we needed to close the room and mark it out of service, and he agreed. That night, the system still showed the guest checked in. The following morning, the room was back in inventory and marked occupied again. Corporate got involved and asked us to keep the room closed while they investigated. When I pulled up the guest file, the ID scan was gone, even though the name and payment record remained. Later that evening, the front desk bell rang again. I looked up and saw the same man standing in the doorway, looking exactly the same as the first night. He asked for a room, and I told him we were fully booked. He nodded calmly and walked back out, stopping briefly to look up at the window of the room he had requested before disappearing into the dark. The next morning, the room was marked vacant for the first time in weeks. The system showed the guest had checked out during the night. Housekeeping entered and found nothing unusual. No one ever saw him leave. I quit that job a month later. Corporate blamed the situation on a database synchronization issue and reopened the room. Sometimes, when I drive past the motel late at night, I still notice one light on in that room. I don't slow down to look anymore,